Right, so last week we started talking about Moses, and we worked our way through Moses' parents and the faith they had in preserving Moses' life versus submitting to the edict of Pharaoh and killing him. And then we got to Moses, and we left off with a question. And so my question was, when you read verse 27, and it says, by faith he, talking about Moses, forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured to see in him who is invisible. Is this Moses' first flight from Egypt or the Exodus?
Oh yeah, you said that last week. It was like a teaser. You said yes and no.
So is it his first flight when he's 40?
I would assume
Or the second?
the Exodus, because the first time he fled Egypt, it was out of fear.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. All right, how many are in that camp? Raise your hand.
The second?
How many are in the second camp? Raise your hand. How many of you have absolutely no idea? Okay. So there's a little bit of debate between the two, and we'll talk about it. So if we talk about the first flight, the obvious thing that everyone thinks about is when you go into Exodus and you read it, Moses wasn't running away in faith, right? It literally says he killed somebody. The next day he's trying to help his brethren stop beating up each other. And they're like, are you going to be a judge over us and kill us like you did the Egyptian? Moses is like, wait, people know that they killed the Egyptian. I better get out of here. And so he's fleeing in fear, right? And so you have this distinction. You have faith versus fear. And so we're thinking Moses flees in fear, so this can't be talking about the first Exodus when he's 40. Makes sense, right? So the other issue, if we say that he left during the Exodus, we've got another problem. And the problem is, if you look at how the author is talking about things here, you kind of get an idea that he's going in chronological order with Moses, because he starts with Moses' parents, right? And he starts with Moses' birth. And then directly after Moses forsaking Egypt, they start talking about keeping the Passover. Now, they kept the Passover before the Exodus. Does that make sense? And then they passed through the Red Sea directly after that. So it seems like he's talking about things in chronological order. The other issue is, in the second one, not fearing the wrath of the king, the Egyptians were kicking them out. Like God had so destroyed the country at that point that they were begging the Israelites to leave. So what wrath is he fearing? So the wrath of the king only makes sense during the first flight, but Moses forsaking Egypt in faith only makes sense during the second Exodus, right? So you've got a little bit of a seeming inconsistency. Are we seeing it? And it's really not that big of a deal, because the author never says he's going in chronological order to begin with. And so if you want to take the second, that's fine. It's not a big deal. He never claims I'm doing this chronologically. It just makes sense reading it that he's doing so. I tend to lean towards the first one, and I'll kind of explain why. So look at verse 23. So verse 23, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents because he saw that he was a proper child, and they were what? All right, so in verse 23, we have this kind of comparison between faith and fear, right? Mm-hmm. All right, now go to verse number 30-something. Yeah, go to verse 29. And verse 29 says, by faith what? They passed through the Red Sea. Has anyone read the Exodus account recently? Was Israel doing anything but showing faith at that point? No. All right. So verse 29, at the end of Moses, talking about Moses, you have this idea of faith and fear. And so Moses forsaking Egypt falls right in the middle of this. And so the reason I lean towards the first one is because verse 23 and verse 29 seem to form a little bit of a unit. And this is not a proof, this is just my reasoning. So if you want to disagree, it's not important enough to fuss about. I'm just explaining how I work my way through it. And so verse 23, the parents have, here's the king's edict, here's what God wants, I'm going to do what God wants. Verse 29, you have, here's the king right behind us. God's separated with a wall of darkness or a cloud or something between them, and he parts the Red Sea and they need to go through it. They're terrified. And yet they still walk through it. He says they do it by faith. So you have a comparison of faith and fear there. And so looking at it and seeing that it seems to be chronologically talking about Moses' life, the idea of faith and fear come exactly into play when Moses is fleeing Egypt the first time. Because Moses is afraid, right? Yet it says that he did it by faith. Therefore, there's some interaction here where at one point he was afraid, but he seemed to come to an understanding of being faithful towards God in the midst of it. And by that kind of faith, he was able to overcome his fear. So that's kind of how I've reasoned through it. And again, you're free to disagree. It's not the entire point. When I was reading about it, I was like, oh, this is interesting. I wanted to kind of posit it and throw it out there and see what everyone had to think. And so we've got this idea that verses 23 through 29 is we have a comparison of even if you're terrified, it's still possible to be faithful. Even if you're showing absolutely no indication of any kind of faith at all. Like Moses isn't showing faith by murdering an Egyptian, right? Like that's not an indication of showing faith. And yet, at some point, he is able to overcome that circumstance and overcome fleeing in fear to have faith in God. And even if it tells you why, it says, for he endured to seeing him who is invisible. So at some point in Moses' mind, he has this fixation upon, and I'm just going to label it promise, because that's been the highlight the entire way through the book. Moses has this idea of seeing God. He's seeing God, the one who cannot be seen, and Moses has his sight, so to speak, fixed upon him. And in doing so, he's able to overcome whatever fear that he was experiencing at the time where he was fleeing Egypt. Yes, sir.
So I have a question. There's a common conception of people that would say that, like, if you're in fear, well, then you don't really have faith because you're not really believing. But if we're defining faith as a believing response to God's revealed word, that would be whether, no matter how you feel, it doesn't negate fear.
Right.
Fear makes
Exactly.
it present, but it's what are you going to do about it?
Exactly.
Okay.
It's, are you going to submit to what you're afraid of, or are you going to submit to what God says regardless of what you're afraid of? At some point, your allegiance to God has to be above whatever you're experiencing. Okay, we're going to look at some of the rest of this chapter. People experience some hard things. Like, life was not easy. And so, just because you have faith doesn't mean you're going to never experience a problem in life. I was reading Exodus 17. This is a complete aside. I'm going to do a Devo about it. But Exodus 17, Israel is out in the middle of nowhere and they have no water. And so they do what they're prone to do, start murmuring against God. And then at the end of that section, he calls the place Meribah, and then their response was, they tempted the Lord, saying, is the Lord with us or not? And so they had this idea that if God was with us, then the trial should not be here. So evidence of God being with me would be the absence of trials, and therefore the presence of trial means the absence of God. Which, that's not how it works. The presence of God in your life doesn't mean the absence of trials.
Right.
And that's a huge misunderstanding, because you can even read that New Testament, the blind go, why this guy get born blind? His parents or he sin? It's like it had nothing to do with sin. It had nothing to do with somebody did. And so they have this misconception that if God is with you, then all things are just going to be rosy. Not the case. Not the case. And so you get this idea, so we have faith and fear. And so Moses forsakes Egypt, fleeing in fear, but eventually it turns into some kind of faith response. And that's not clear in Exodus at all, other than when he goes back, he's done spoken to God and seen the burning bush and everything else. And so when you move on, it goes through faith, he kept the Passover, and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. And I think most of us understand this, talking about the Passover. It's the final plague on Egypt. And Moses is told by God, kill a lamb, and sprinkle the blood or splatter the door on the doorpost. And then overnight when I come by, anytime I see that blood, I'm going to pass over that household. And on the houses where I don't see the blood, I'm going to destroy the firstborn of that house, whether it's an animal or person or whatever. And so they kept this Passover by faith. In other words, God said something, even if it doesn't make any sense. Like, why would blood on the doorpost do anything? You know what I mean? Like, the whole thing seemingly, and again, when I say absurd, I'm talking from a human perspective. From a human perspective, that's crazy. Like, blood on a doorpost is not going to stop anybody. But their faith in obeying God allows them to escape, whereas God is going to destroy everything else. And so you've got a connection between I have faith, my faith is evidenced by the fact that when God says something, I'm going to do that, even if it doesn't make any sense to me at all. Which, the very next passage, by faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians, essaying to do, were drowned. Now think about that for a second, because the reason I'm highlighting, and we're not going to finish today, but that's okay. The reason I'm highlighting the absurdity is because put yourself in that situation. You just got kicked out of Egypt, and the Egyptian pharaoh, for whatever reason, is like, oh wait, we want them back. Like my whole kingdom just got destroyed by their god, but yeah, we're gonna chase after them. Yeah, and the only way forward is passing through a Red Sea. Like, would you not be absolutely terrified out of your mind? Like, we're always hard on the Israelis, on the Jews back then, because they did not believe God. But let's not discount the amount of fear they were probably feeling at that point. Would you not be absolutely terrified? You've got an army behind you, and you've got a Red Sea in front of you, parted, and you're going to walk through it on dry land?
The everyday occurrence,
Right. These things don't happen. That's the whole point. These things don't happen. They're not phenomenologically possible. And yet God says, walk through. God says, Moses, hold up your rod. And Moses holds up his rod. I mean, the east wind blew all overnight, I understand it. But if you think about it, it's like, hold up your rod. Okay, what's this going to do?
Right. Something really cool.
And so they pass through on dry land. And then the Egyptians get drowned. And that's done. And so even though they were terrified, you can go back and read the account. They thought God was trying to kill them. I'm sitting there going, well, if God was trying to kill you, why did he have to do that? It's like, why would he have done all of the things he did before to bring you to that point? But they didn't understand that because God was with them, that didn't mean nothing bad would ever happen. And so, but they give them credit. They walked through by faith. Even though they were terrified and complaining, and they all ended up dying over 40 years anyways because they refused to believe God. At some point, even the most minute amount of faith that you have is something that God commends, which is really, really amazing. Now, the reason we're talking about absurdities here is because the next two examples, we're probably going to finish on this because we really want to hone in on these. The next two examples are Jericho and Rahab. All right, who remembers Jericho? Okay. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, Israel's just gotten out of Egypt. They go into the desert. They stay at a mount for about a year or so, I believe. God gives them the law, and then they start marching towards the promised land. They march towards the promised land. They send spies in. The spies come back, tend bring an evil report. They don't get to go into the promised land. They wander around for 40 years until all the people 20 years and older, except for a few of them, dead. And then the next generation passes over the Jordan, and the very first city that they come up against to topple is Jericho. And Jericho had stood for several decades at that point, from what I understand. And it's a fortified walled city. It's not a large city. Like, when we think city, we think like Dallas, like some gigantic metropolis. Well, that's not the case here. It was like maybe several hundred meters across. So it's not a giant city. It's what we would call a town. But the point is, it's a fortified town. Like, it had super, 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 super tough walls. You're not conquering this thing, right? Now, normally, if you're going to siege a city, and it's got fortified walls, and it's got archers at the walls, and people who are going to throw stones if you get too close, and they're going to pour boiling pitch on you if you get up to the wall, how do you siege a city?
Time.
Like, huh?
Lots of time and not letting them
Starve it out.
resupply.
Okay, so you've got one option. One option is to starve them out. But so what you do is you form an embankment around the entire city. You have an embargo. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out. The town will eventually run out of food and they'll all starve to death. That's one option. What was the other option?
Destroy the walls and or scale them.
Build towers.
Trebuchets.
Yes, okay. I didn't have trebuchets all the way back then. So you build battering rams, you get catapults, you build embankments and towers that you can push up to the wall. You climb up to the top, you have a bloody fight at the top, and yeah, you eventually topple it that way. Did God tell them to do either of those? No. What does God tell them to do?
Walk around it.
Walk in circles.
Okay, basically. So for 7 days, on the first day, they walk all the way around it, not making a sound. On the second day, they walk once, all the way around it, not making a sound. Rinse and repeat, the third, fourth, fifth, sixth day. right? Isn't that crazy?
That's crazy. Yeah.
Like, walls don't fall down because you walk around them. And if you were part of the Jericho Defense Force, what would you be doing?
Laughing.
At the very least. Now, they're walking a respectful distance away because they don't want to get shot at by the archers and stuff like that. But you are ridiculing these people. Like, this is the people that you heard that God delivered them and parted the Red Sea, and here they are walking around your city. Like, what?
I disagree.
Okay.
I doubt that they were ridiculing. I think they were scared to death.
They were what?
Had no idea what was going on.
Possibly.
Because no other conquering nation had done that before.
Fair enough.
And Rahab did say that those people were terrified of Israel. So when they show up
Fair
for
enough.
an attack, they'd probably be like, what the heck is happening?
Yeah, this is some weird
Yeah.
mystical
Jericho may have heard of
religious-
what happened to Egypt a
Mhm.
few years prior.
Yeah. But you will agree that walking around a city to watch the walls fall down is absurd.
It looks
Yes.
silly. For sure.
Well, how they respond or how they didn't respond, it's absurd. Now, one put it, so on the seventh day. On the seventh day, they walk around it 7 times. Then the priests blow the ram's horn trumpets, and everyone shouts, and the walls fall down. And then they all rush it. And so I wanted to read this quote, because somebody put it one way, just to capture the absurdity of what God's asking them to do. Cities do not fall by mystics making bad music on ram's horns. I'll read that again, because it's funny. Cities do not fall by mystics making bad music on ram's horns. It doesn't make any sense, right? It's ludicrous. And yet, that's what God told them to do. And so their faith is evidenced by the fact this is what God said to do. It doesn't make any sense at all. Like, this isn't the military strategy of the day. It's never been the military strategy of the day. But hey, this is what God told us to do, and this is what we're going to do. And so Joshua gets it from probably a Christophany right before they march to Jericho, and that's their orders. That's what they do, and then God comes through for them, right? And so, but walking around the city to watch the walls fall down is absurd. I mean, the walls might still be standing now if they were still walking around the city. I mean, they're just not going to fall down. But God said, do this, and then God came through for them. So they evidenced their faith in God, and God's like, okay, boom. And so the next question then, or the next person we'll probably leave off on this, because I really want to talk about this, is Rahab. And so the record we have in Hebrews chapter 11 is, by faith the harlot Rahab perished not with them that believed not, when she had received the spies with peace. Okay, so Rahab makes people uncomfortable. And the reason she makes people uncomfortable is her occupation. I read a commentator go out of his way to tell you that the Hebrew word for how they called Rahab, the Hebrew word for prostitute, I don't know if this is true or not, but the Hebrew word for that also indicates something else. And so he tried to walk his way out of Rahab's an actual prostitute because it could refer to this other thing too. Like, it really makes people uncomfortable. And you have to be careful because, and this is not part of the message, but when we see people like that, like even saying see people like that. So when I'm saying that, here's what I've got going on in my head. When I say that, I'm automatically implying I am not that. Mm-hmm. Therefore, I am looking down on that. Mm-hmm. And this, because I am not this makes me uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so people look at Rahab and they go, Rahab's this prostitute. She's like the lowest of the low. And I'm not, for the sake of keeping it G-rated, we're not going to go into those things because it's not necessary. Everyone can understand or can ask questions later. So she's like the lowest of the low. And yet, we have an example in Hebrews 11 of this lowest of the low person, a woman of all things. Women were not thought highly of at that time. Like, they weren't. Sorry, women, they weren't. And so, not even in the New Testament times were they thought highly of. I think when I was reading in, I forget where I picked this up, but in Greek society, the woman's job was to stay inside and not be seen. In Persian society, I think it was the same. Like, women didn't have rights or anything like that back then. Like, they were They were just low. And a person as a prostitute's even lower than low. And yet here the author is including her in the Hall of Faith, which is really, really amazing. But the question I have for everybody is, how did Rahab acquire faith? Like, you have a person working in the red rope districts, for lack of a better word. And so she's working in a place where, you know, the seedy, dirtier parts of society would go or whatever. You know, how does a person in that estate end up having faith in God?
She made a choice.
Based off of what?
Well, the little bit of faith that she already had,
Mm-hmm.
that God gave her.
Maybe she heard stories.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Evidence.
Hmm?
Evidence
Right, which evidence?
of the stories that have been told of the spies coming and talking to her.
Mhm. Basically. Can I call them rumors? So, in Rahab's occupation, she would encounter a lot of traveling merchants and stuff like that. And so she would have picked up on the happenings of the nations and countries and cities around them. And so Rahab, all she heard was what God did with Israel in the Red Sea. By her own testimony, you can read it in Joshua. What God did with the Israelites in the Red Sea, and how God helped them overcome the kingdoms of Sihon and Og. Or the kings of Sihon and Og, rather. That's all she knew. Like, she didn't know anything about the Messiah. She didn't know anything about sacrifice. She didn't know anything about the right or wrong ways to live. She knew none of that. All she had was, I heard somebody tell me that this happened, basically. And I heard that this happened. And she could corroborate it, because multiple people, I mean, when kingdoms get thrown down, that's big news. Like, she's going to be able to corroborate that those things she has heard and build a case for a reason why she should believe it. But that's all she had. She didn't have an oracle from God. God didn't come down to her, as far as we know, because she didn't say, when she received the spy, she didn't say, yeah, God talked to me like 3 days ago, told me y'all were coming and I should receive you. She had none of that. All she had was, God did something at the Red Sea 40 years ago, and God overthrew these two kingdoms. Now, apparently everybody else in the country had heard that too, because the entire city was terrified at this point. What were you going to say?
She also had the testimony of the men who came. They also had the testimony of the men who came.
Right.
That probably bolstered her faith in God, because they were respectable people and they didn't take advantage.
Yeah, that's a thought too, yes. And somebody actually brought that out in one of the books I read, so that's good, yeah. And so that's it. She had, this is what I heard from the news, the grapevine, so to speak, and these are the two people that came to me. That's it. And so based off of those things, two random people that she immediately recognized as spies, by the way, they were trying to be incognito, and she immediately knows who they are. So be wary. Don't look down on people that are in that group. They have experiences and skills and things like that that people who are not in that group just don't have. And she immediately knows who they are. And so, based off the testimony of two people and the events that she heard about 40 years ago in the kingdoms that fell, she has decided to risk her entire life off of, this is the God that I've heard about. I'm going to put all of my faith in him, and I am going to risk my entire life on it. I'm going to stake my life on it. And so what does she do? So she receives the spies of peace, right? And so the exchange is, I'm going to let you two go out a different way. I'm going to lie about it. That way they don't come chase after you. You know, we're not going to get into the idea of Rahab lying and stuff like that. Like, that's something far beyond where we're going in Hebrews. And so she does all these things. She receives them with peace. She sends them out. And she's willing to risk her entire life on it. And so when they come back, they say, lay a red rope down. And then when we topple the city, you know, we'll come get you. And everybody that's in the house will spare. And so Rahab, again, risks her entire life on this proposition. Like, her entire life. Because think about it. What happens if she does all those things? Like, eventually somebody in that house is going to talk, right? And what happens to everybody in that house once somebody talks? Yeah. They die. They probably get brutally tortured. And then they die. And so she's willing to risk her entire life off of the testimony of 2 people, and some things she's heard about. Like, I'm going to argue that Rahab probably had more faith than the entire Exodus generation put together.
Right.
Because they saw the works of God, right? They saw what God did. They had God's law at that point after a year. They had the book of Leviticus and everything else. They knew what God wanted. They saw the mighty works of God. They see what God did through Moses. They have the covenant promises that God's promised them. And they refuse to believe. And here you have a prostitute who has none of that. All she has is some rumors that she's verified to be true and the testimony of 2 people that are trying to be spies. And she's willing to risk her entire life to trust that. And so when we go through this list, I got to Rahab, and one guy wrote 10 pages on it. Like, he writes 10 pages on every single section. And I get to Hebrews, he writes 10 pages like everybody. It was like quadrupled my reading. And so it's really, if you think about Rahab, we have a tendency to label people as, they're people like that. Yeah, she was a prostitute, so what? Like, we have people now that they get saved out of that lifestyle, right? And they turn into these amazing servants of God, right? And so I guess what I'm trying to say is don't look down on those kinds of people. They need the gospel too. And God can use even the lowest of the low, or what we would deem as the lowest of the low, and have somebody like that be a shining example for the rest of human history.
Right.
And she's even one of the, she's in the line of Christ too. Like, she's of the line that goes all the way to Christ. And so here she is memorialized for all of eternity. For all of us to look and go, wow, this person had basically 3 things. And she was willing to stake her entire life on it, stake the entire life of her family on it, and risk everything because she trusted in what God had to say. And she didn't even know hardly anything. And that's, honestly, to me, that's incredible. We'll finish out Hebrews 11 next week. And I just wanted to spend some time on Rahab, and we'll finish off the rest of the book next week. So read verses 32 through 40. And we'll get into that next week, hopefully finish it out.